This video is for Unit 3.1, Introduction to Cells. The first thing I want to do is just take you through some pictures of the variety of cells that we have. I think lots of times people envision cells as the pictures they see in their textbooks, and really cells look a lot different from that. Most of these pictures are taken with pretty sophisticated microscopes. They're very powerful, can zoom in a lot, and also they have additional color added so you can see the cell parts better. But still, they're pretty cool. This one's an example of a paramecium, which is a type of a cell that lives in water. It is a single-celled organism that swims around in the water. You can see those little flagella or cilia on there, those little hairs around it. And they can both do photosynthesis and eat other organisms as well. First thing I'm going to do is just show you kind of these are also more protists, which are related to the paramecium. This is an example of a type of bacteria, this long green chain made of many cells that can go through photosynthesis. It's called a cyanobacteria. The little football-shaped thing on top is a diatom cell. Diatom is a type of algae whose cell structures are made out of a kind of an element related to glass, so you can think of them as kind of a crunchy algae. This picture has some cells from your body in it. These are called neurons. They're cells in your brain and the rest of your nervous system. They have long branching tendrils that come out of them. And this is an example of some plant cells. In the root structure of plants, we have tiny single-celled parts that connect together to form this kind of branching pattern as well. Here's another picture of a diatom. That's that glassy type of algae. Here's another protist, kind of like the paramecium that I showed you earlier, the football thing with the little cilia. You can see this one has little hairs or cilia on it as well. And then finally, here's a picture of some cancer cells. Now, cancer could happen to any cells of your body, but I like this picture in particular because of the bright colors. You can see the nucleus, or the purple part of the cell, pretty easily in each one. So when we see all these cells now, it's pretty amazing to see that all these different types of cells exist, but it hasn't really been that long that scientists have known about cells. So over time, as we've learned more and microscopes have gotten more and more powerful, scientists have developed something called the cell theory. This is all of our ideas about cells. So what we can say so far about cells is that we know that, number one, all living things are made of one or more cells. Sometimes, again, they're one-celled organisms, like those paramecium that swim in pond water. Sometimes there are millions of cells, like us or other large creatures. Two, scientists know that cells are the basic unit and structure of organization for all living things. In other words, in order to build a human, you need cells. In order to build a plant, you need cells. And those cells and how they're put together determine what that organism is. Plant cells are put together in a certain way to make plants. Human cells are put together in a certain way to make humans. And then finally, number three, we can only get cells from previously existing cells. In other words, we cannot have a cell just spontaneously appear or appear out of nowhere. Cells only come from other cells, and when they do that, they pass on their genetic material or their DNA. We are going to talk about two types of cells in this class. The two types of cells we're going to discuss are prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. We're going to list some characteristics of each. Number one, prokaryotic cells tend to be smaller than the eukaryotic cells. Not always, but in general, that's one thing to look for. Another thing is that prokaryotic cells don't have a nucleus. The nucleus is the place of the cell that holds the genetic material, or the DNA. Eukaryotic cells do have a nucleus. Now, this doesn't mean that prokaryotic cells don't have DNA. They do have DNA, or genetic material. Their DNA is loose in the cytoplasm. In other words, it's loose in the cell. Where the nucleus in a eukaryotic cell is kind of like a little container for the DNA. Prokaryotic cells don't have many structures inside them. Eukaryotic cells are more complex, which means they have more structures. And finally, some examples of prokaryotic cells. It's our bacteria group. And for examples of eukaryotic cells, it's basically everything else. So plants, animals, fungi, so like mushrooms and yeast and things like that. And then finally that last group that I showed you the picture of the paramecium that swims in the pond water, those are called protists. So there you have it. Prokaryotic cells are small, they don't have a nucleus, their DNA is loose in the cell, they have very few structures. One example of that is our bacterial cells. You saw some of those in class and you remember how tiny they were. The eukaryotic cells are plant cells, animal cells, fungi cells, protists. We saw a lot of those in lab. They are bigger. They have a nucleus, which is a container for their DNA. They tend to be more complicated because they have more structures. At the prokaryotic cell, or again, remember these are your bacteria. Again. So when you look at these under the microscope, as you remember, you don't see all these structures. But if we could really zoom in on a bacterial cell, these are the things we would see. So we could cut open into the outer membrane of the bacterial cell. Okay, they do have something called a cell membrane that kind of encloses the cell. You're going to see that DNA is this kind of stringy stuff in the middle, kind of loose in the cell. The filling of the cell is called the cytoplasm. And you're going to see, in most cases, something called a cell wall, which is a thicker structure around the cell. And then finally, what I want you to know is they also have things called ribosomes in there, and you'll learn more about ribosomes later. But beyond the nucleus, the nucleoid, which is where the DNA is loose in the cell, and the ribosomes and the cytoplasm, there's really not much in the cell. So again, just to double check, genetic material loose in the cytoplasm. They have a cell membrane, cell wall, cytoplasm, and ribosomes. And that's about it. Very simple, very small. You may want to draw yourself a picture as well as these notes along with it. Now, before we go on to eukaryotic cells, let's look at the difference between a bacteria and a virus. So first of all, number one, viruses are not cells. Okay, so what they are instead is just a small packet of nucleic acid. Okay, remember nucleic acid is basically, oh, this is wrong. Back up. They are a small packet of protein, that's what we should say here. And it's not writing for some reason here. Here we go. So, small packet of protein and DNA. So around the outside, I'll do that in this yellow. Okay, that is the protein built around a packet of DNA, and the DNA is right here in the middle. Okay, so it's like a little envelope of DNA. They are not cells because they are not able to actually reproduce on their own. They need a host cell to reproduce. In other words, they have to go into another cell and use the abilities that that cell has to make copies of themselves. They cannot make copies of themselves on their own. So therefore we don't consider them cells, and we don't consider them living creatures as well. The final point here is that they are much smaller than bacteria. Our microscopes in class are not big enough to see a virus. We need a very powerful microscope called an electronic microscope or electron microscope. Okay, now we're going to go over those eukaryotic cells. Remember, these are the cells that are found in animals, plants, fungi, and protists. They're bigger, they have a nucleus that contains their DNA, and they're a little more complicated. They have lots of structures in them, but these are the 7 that I want you to know about. So the first one being the nucleus is one we've talked about a little bit already. So you should have some background on that, but I'll get into that one in more detail. The other 6 are listed here, and you'll find more information about them in your book, what they do and what kinds of organisms have them. You'll see that over here, number 6 and 7, I have a little asterisk. That means they are found in plant cells only. So plant cells have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So they have a nucleus, a cell membrane, ribosomes, mitochondria, and a nuclear membrane. But they also have 6 and 7. Animal cells only have 1 through 5. So cell wall and chloroplast, plant cells only. All right, so let's look at this animal cell in a little more detail. So we've got the nucleus, which is not always in the center of the cell, but it is, remember, a container for the DNA. So that goes right there in that picture. The nuclear membrane is just basically the packaging around the nucleus. So it holds all the nuclear material in. Remember, the DNA is found in that nucleus. So the nuclear membrane is what holds all the DNA in. Ribosomes. You can see there are free ribosomes, and there are also some ribosomes that are attached to this stuff. There's little dots. Those are ribosomes there. The free ribosomes are just loose. Those are basically for making protein. We'll talk lots about that later, why that's important. The mitochondria. Mitochondria are these kind of bean-looking things right here. The mitochondria make energy, and that energy, remember, that we make in our bodies is called ATP. We talked about cellular respiration earlier in the year. This is where cellular respiration happens. This is where your body takes sugar and oxygen and makes ATP. And then the final thing I want you to know in the cell diagram is this cell membrane, or sometimes called the plasma membrane. That is just this purple kind of container for the cell. So the purple container that holds all the cell's parts together here is the plasma membrane. Remember, not every cell has this shape, but every cell will have these parts arranged differently, but they always have the same function. For some of these, you'll need to look into your book to get more information about what they do, so I want you to look back at that and see what you can find. But this is a good start for the parts of the animal cell. All right, this is a picture of a plant cell. You can see it's more blocky. The main reason for that is because plant cells have what we call a cell wall to help hold their shape. They also have a cell membrane. It's a little bit harder to see in this picture, but you can see there's kind of a layer on the inside here. And that layer is the cell membrane. Chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are the green structures here. That's where photosynthesis takes place. Photosynthesis, remember, is taking the sun's energy, combining it with carbon and water, and making some glucose or sugar, food for the plant. They also, though, have mitochondria. That's this little bean-shaped thing again. Remember, plants and animals go through cellular respiration, so they both have mitochondria. They also have ribosomes. Ribosomes are the little dots kind of scattered throughout here. Again, still making protein. They also have a nucleus and a nuclear membrane, shown here at the edge of the cell. So remember, the things that they have in common are those 1 through 5 structures. The things that are different are the chloroplasts and the cell wall. So plant cells are the only ones that have the chloroplasts and the cell wall between the animal and the plant cells. All right, we're going to wrap this up with a little bit more information about the nucleus. So remember, the nucleus is the part of the cell that holds the DNA. It holds the genetic material. It's surrounded by this nuclear envelope. The nuclear envelope has little holes in it. We call those the nuclear pores. So the nuclear envelope is just kind of like the nuclear membrane. It's just a different name for it. But it has holes in it so things can get in and out of the nucleus. And we'll talk later about what those things are that go in and out. It also has at the very center, the very core here, something called the nucleolus. And that's where those ribosomes are made. Remember those little specks or those little dots that make protein? They are made in the nucleus, and when they're made, they have to travel out of the holes so they can go to the rest of the cell. Finally, the nucleus has something called chromosomes. Chromosome is basically coiled up DNA. So if we take DNA, which is a molecule in a long strand, and we get it all coiled up into a shape, we call that coiled up shape of DNA a chromosome. And you can see a picture of that right here. Okay, they showed them as X's in this diagram. So the DNA that we have in our nucleus is called a chromosome, and we actually have quite a few chromosomes in our nucleus holding our DNA. That's it for this video. Remember to fill in your table and all of your other notes from your book assignment and or video review. Drawing diagrams is always a good thing, but you can go back to your book as well if there's any information you can't get.